The private dining suite on the 42nd floor had been engineered to intimidate. Crystal walls, soft amber lighting, and a table that looked more like a negotiation altar than a place to eat. Every surface gleamed with the kind of curated wealth that demanded silence. And silence was exactly what followed the accusation. The Sheikh, tall, immaculately dressed, voice edged with a clipped Gulf dialect, held up the missing black opal cufflink like it was a verdict. "This," he said, turning it between his fingers, "was on my table. Now it is gone." His eyes locked on the smallest person in the room, the waitress. Her name was Layla Marin. Few ever used it. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, posture straight, breathing tight. She wasn't dressed for conflict. She wore the polished anonymity of service staff. Black vest, white shirt, hair folded into a quiet knot. But her gaze was steady, disturbingly steady, and that alone unsettled one of the richest men in the room. The investors at the table leaned away from her as though guilt traveled by proximity. One of them whispered, "Just apologize and return it. He'll let it go." Another murmured, "These people, they're always hiding something." She said nothing, because she knew the truth didn't need volume. It needed timing. Beside the Sheikh lay a leather folder, his lawyer's contract for the $240 million acquisition he planned to finalize tonight. A contract she wasn't meant to see. A contract she had carried in, unnoticed, when she delivered the final tasting menu. And in the 5 seconds he wasn't watching, she had glimpsed something impossible buried in the fine print, an anomaly so dangerous it made her chest hollow out. But first, the accusation. The Sheikh leaned closer, lowering his voice to a cutting tone, letting the dialect turn sharp. "You think I will not know when someone like you touches what is mine?" The room held its breath. Layla finally lifted her eyes to him and answered, not in the dialect he wielded like a blade, but in flawless, resonant, classical Arabic. The effect was instantaneous. Chairs stilled. The investors froze. Even the Sheikh blinked, surprised, as if someone had shifted gravity without warning. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. Not yet. She simply placed the service tray down with surgical calm and stepped back from the table. The room saw a waitress. They had no idea they were looking at the only person in that suite who understood the entire trap unfolding, and she was already calculating her next move. He stared at her walking away, unable to understand how he had missed someone like her. The moment Layla stepped behind the service partition, a half wall of frosted glass meant to hide staff movement, the world felt thinner, like a film pulled tight over a bruise. The dining suite was still visible through the narrow slit meant for tray service. She watched the men, billionaires, advisors, acquisitive minds trained to spot weakness, argue quietly about her as if she were a misplaced utensil. She'd seen that pattern her entire life, the instant transformation from person to inconvenience. She pressed her hands against the cool marble counter, grounding herself. The opal cufflink accusation wasn't random. She knew how these rooms worked. Wealth didn't like friction. It liked explanations that confirmed its prejudices. She had become the perfect vessel for their discomfort the moment something went wrong. And something had gone very wrong. She replayed what she had seen earlier. The leather contract folder opened a few centimeters too wide. The Sheikh's senior legal advisor flipping through the acquisition papers with the bored precision of someone who believed the deal was already a victory. The corner of one page had lifted, revealing a faint reddish shimmer near the binding edge. Ink not meant to be on modern contracts. Iron gall ink. Medieval formulation. Impossible to appear accidentally. It wasn't a signature line. It was a modification, grafted onto the contract in a way that would only be visible under angled light. A trap placed so elegantly that even seasoned lawyers could miss it, and she knew that kind of ink. because she had studied it for 6 years before life dismantled her. She closed her eyes, letting memories she preferred buried surface in fragments. Her scholarship revoked when her mother fell ill, her research abandoned, the immigration paperwork that trapped her into service jobs she never imagined, the professor who wrote, "Brilliant but too quiet for fieldwork." Quiet. Yes. Invisible. Absolutely. But never unseeing. A soft click interrupted her thoughts. The maitre d' stepped toward her, tension stiffening his jaw. "He's furious. They say one of the investors found the cufflink under your station." His face tightened, apologetic but powerless. "Layla, they want you to stay until security arrives." Of course they did. A convenient culprit completes the narrative. Through the glass slit, she saw the Sheikh tapping an obsidian pen against the contract folder, the same pen he intended to use to lock himself into a deal that would cost him far more than any missing cufflink. She inhaled slowly. Fear was alive in her, sharp and bright, but another instinct rose beneath it. Older, anchored, unyielding. She couldn't leave. And perhaps, she thought, she wasn't meant to. The door to the suite opened again. A new team entered, the museum liaison, 2 archivists, and an appraiser carrying a velvet case. The object they were unveiling tonight, the so-called Bark manuscript, was the centerpiece of the entire acquisition. Every man in that room believed its provenance unquestionable. But Layla felt something twist inside her. The manuscript wasn't just the main prize. It was the key to the ink she had seen. She straightened, stepping back toward the glass slit, watching the Sheikh's hand hover over the contract. The truth was gathering weight. When people overlook you long enough, they forget you are listening. They brought the manuscript out with ritualistic carefulness. White gloves, measured breaths, velvet cloth pulled back like a magician unveiling a miracle. The Bark manuscript, allegedly 14th century, supposedly pristine, valued at $240 million because of a single poetic legend that it contained the earliest marginal notes linking 2 dynasties no one believed were ever connected. The investors leaned forward, hunger softening their features. The Sheikh nodded with reverence, his earlier anger folding neatly into the performance of cultured authority. In their minds, the manuscript crowned the acquisition. The contract was merely the chain binding it all together. But Layla watched the appraiser's hands with a sharper lens. He held the manuscript too loosely. He flipped pages too quickly. And the edges, God, the edges, were too even for a document that old. Her pulse tightened. She hadn't touched medieval vellum in years, but the memory of texture lived in her fingertips. Vellum should resist movement, hold a faint curve, carry micro-warping from centuries of humidity shifts. Yet this manuscript lay flat, obedient, almost eager. Obedience in old documents was a lie. The Sheikh smiled proudly as the appraiser recited the provenance, private collection. Authenticated twice. Perfect condition for its age. He nodded with every sentence as though confirmation were being sculpted around him. Layla knew better. Perfect condition meant nothing. Perfect stories meant even less. Behind her, 2 security officers entered quietly, one of them glancing toward her with the detached look of someone escorting a problem, not a person. Her breath thinned. She felt the old shame rising, the same humiliation she'd endured at immigration interviews, scholarship rejections, loan offices. The feeling of being watched only when someone needed a suspect. But the manuscript? The ink? The contract? She couldn't let the Sheikh sign. Not because she cared for him. He had already reduced her to a stereotype without hesitation. But because the trap was bigger than his arrogance. It would swallow dozens of people. It would bankrupt teams. It would destroy reputations. And she knew exactly how the trap worked, even before seeing the missing cufflink suddenly found under her station. Someone was staging distractions, creating noise, drawing every eye toward the waitress while they slid something catastrophic into place. The maitre d' whispered urgently, "Layla, please, don't make this worse. Just stay quiet." She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the manuscript's spine. The appraiser had turned the book just enough for her to see the inner binding threads. And the stitch pattern, God, the stitch pattern was anachronistic by 4 centuries. This wasn't a masterpiece, it was a reconstruction wrapped in myth and greed. If no one stopped them, the Sheikh would sign a contract that concealed a forfeiture clause, one activated by the ink modification, and the fake manuscript would become the justification for seizing half his estate when the fraud inevitably surfaced. She felt her hands trembling, not from fear, from certainty. She had seen enough. And yet, behind all of this, threading through the chaos like a quiet undertow, lived a single truth. Sometimes invisibility teaches you to see what everyone else refuses to notice. Security didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Their presence alone pressed the air tighter, shrinking her world down to a 5-foot radius of tension and expectation. The maitre d' lingered near the door, wringing his hands, hoping she would simply comply and disappear quietly. But the room wouldn't release her. Not yet. The Sheikh was reviewing the manuscript now with almost theatrical reverence, tracing its margins as though communing with history itself. His advisors hovered around him, whispering in the clipped, hurried confidence of men who believed they were minutes from sealing a legendary deal. He had no idea how close he was to signing his own ruin. Layla remained against the glass partition, half concealed by shadow. She watched the movements, the glances, the hands, the subtle choreography of a transaction too large for any of them to risk slowing down. The rhythm was unmistakable. They wanted him to sign tonight, before sunrise, before oversight, before doubt. Her doubt, specifically. The security officer nearest her shifted his weight. "Miss, we'll need you to come with us shortly. The Sheikh has requested a statement." His voice was polite, even gentle, a kindness designed to disguise the fact that she was already condemned in their eyes. She felt her throat tighten, not from fear of them, but from the deeper, older ache of being powerless in a moment where she held the one truth that mattered. She didn't have the manuscript. She didn't have the contract. She didn't have authority or title. But she had something more dangerous: knowledge. She watched the appraiser flip another page. This time she caught the faintest flicker of a micro-tear near the inner margin. Too clean, too recent. A restoration attempt. A repair that would only be visible to someone who had spent years studying vellum under microscopes in dim university basements no donor ever visited. Her chest tightened again, but differently now. This wasn't fear. This was recognition. The manuscript wasn't just fake. It was recently tampered with. And the contract? The ink she saw? The hidden clause? None of this was coincidence. This was architecture, a system, a design executed slowly, meticulously, by people who trusted one universal truth. The rich rarely look closely at what flatters them. A sudden burst of laughter drew her attention back to the table. One of the investors clapped the Sheikh's shoulder, saying something about a historic night. Someone else poured champagne. The appraiser nodded enthusiastically, signaling that the manuscript was ready for final authentication. Layla felt something inside her lock into place. If she didn't act, they would bury the truth underneath her humiliation. And by morning, the Sheikh would be legally bound to a contract that transferred control of his new institute, the manuscript, and a chain of assets through a clause written in ink older than the printing press. She inhaled sharply. Then fate intervened. The Sheikh's advisor opened the contract folder fully, and the angled light of the chandelier struck the modified clause again, just enough for her to see the shimmer. The ink had oxidized slightly since the last time she saw it, exposing a reddish halo impossible to fabricate with modern chemistry. Her breath caught. Iron gall ink. On a contract drafted last week, signed by one party, waiting for the second. It wasn't just a modification. It was a trigger, a mechanism that, once signed, would override the main agreement through a medieval inheritance doctrine, effectively handing ownership of the manuscript, the institute, and future rights to the party who planted the clause. A billion-dollar trap, disguised as vintage prestige. And only she could see it. She stepped forward slightly, instinct overriding caution. The nearest security officer raised a hand. "Ma'am, please." But she kept staring at the Sheikh, at the pen in his hand, at the edge of catastrophe he did not know he was standing on. Invisibility, she realized, was a prison. But it was also a vantage point. Sometimes the person no one watches is the only one who can truly see. The presentation shifted into its final act. The archivists dimmed the lights to protect the vellum, though the manuscript was clearly a modern reconstruction. A spotlight narrowed onto the table, isolating the Sheikh, the appraiser, the contract, and the illusion of legitimacy. The investors leaned closer, their faces glowing in gold light, like worshippers gathered before a relic. Layla remained half-shadowed near the partition, but her mind was wide awake now, every detail entering her with surgical precision. The room's rhythm had changed. They weren't merely showcasing the manuscript, they were choreographing certainty. "Note the uniform grain," the appraiser said, his voice soft, almost priestly. "The material is extraordinarily well preserved, a testament to its custodians." Layla almost laughed, quiet, disbelieving. Uniform grain? True vellum carried slight irregularities, like the faint memory of the animal it once belonged to. But this one? Smooth, mechanically consistent. It was lab-grown collagen pressed into imitation parchment. The archivist beside him added, "Observe the ink spreading pattern. Narrow, controlled, authentic to the period." He turned the manuscript slightly. The investors nodded. The Sheikh nodded. Everyone nodded, except her. The spreading pattern was too perfect. Medieval ink seeped into fiber unpredictably. It feathered. It breathed. But these lines, they sat atop the surface like polite guests afraid to trespass. She shifted her weight, heat gathering beneath her ribs. How were these experts, highly paid, internationally recognized, missing what she could see from 20 feet away? They weren't missing it. They were ignoring it. The realization hit her with quiet force. Someone in this room was not just complicit. They were orchestrating it. Her eyes tracked each face. The appraiser's eager enthusiasm. The archivist's unblinking calm. The Sheikh's advisor's tightening jaw. Each time the Sheikh neared the signature page. And the investor to his left. The one who kept tapping his foot under the table, a rhythm of nerves disguised as impatience. The investor, his briefcase, the corner of vellum peeking from the side pocket. Her stomach sank. That was a spare sheet, a test piece. Someone had been matching ink behavior, testing reactions, engineering plausibility. They were building a forgery ecosystem. The appraiser closed the manuscript and stepped aside, letting the Sheikh draw it nearer. "It is flawless," he concluded. "The acquisition will make your cultural institute the envy of the region." Flawless. The word scraped against her senses. Layla watched the Sheikh touch the margin, the same margin she had noticed earlier. His fingers pressed lightly, and the edge bowed inward just enough to confirm her fear. The binding glue was modern, synthetic, flexible even under gentle pressure. Original vellum bindings cracked audibly when touched. She felt the urge to speak rise in her. Not a gentle plea, not a question, but a warning sharpened by years of study, drowned by years of invisibility. But she couldn't step forward yet. not without evidence clear enough to cut through the arrogance in that room. If she interrupted now, they would dismiss her as an angry service worker trying to deflect blame after a theft accusation. She needed a fault line, something undeniable, something they couldn't ignore even if they wanted to. Her eyes scanned the manuscript again, and then she saw it. Near the lower inner margin of page 12, barely visible beneath the spotlight's angle, a microscopic inconsistency in the ruling lines. One of the guidelines, meant to appear hand-drawn by a scribe, was perfectly straight. Too straight. Straight enough to be machine-printed. Heat shot through her spine. This wasn't just a reconstruction. It was a digital facsimile transferred onto manufactured vellum. The trap wasn't academic. It was financial, contractual, and catastrophic. The Sheikh lifted the obsidian pen. Her breath caught. She was running out of time. Truth, she realized, is loud even before you speak it. The Sheikh lifted the pen with the confidence of a man signing inevitability. The contract lay before him like a sleeping predator, silent, elegant, waiting for contact. Layla's pulse hammered. The security officers shifted slightly, sensing the ceremony nearing its conclusion. The maitre d' bowed his head, already anticipating the quiet disaster of escorting her out once the pen touched paper. She watched it all, the choreography of power tightening around her like a noose. But then the appraiser made a mistake. A small one. A single gesture. The kind only people obsessed with their own cleverness commit. He reached across the table to adjust the manuscript, and for a fraction of a second, the velvet cloth he'd moved earlier slid back just far enough to reveal the corner of a laminated certificate tucked underneath. A certificate that should never, ever accompany a genuine 14th century manuscript. Layla's stomach turned. That wasn't an authentication document. It was a calibration sheet, the type used in high-resolution pigment printers to match historical color tones. She felt something shift inside her, a subtle hardening of resolve. They were printing history and selling it for $240 million. Her breath shortened as the Sheikh angled the contract toward himself. The modified clause shimmered faintly again under the chandelier, more visible now as though the ink itself were desperate to expose the trap. Iron gall ink required oxygen to darken. In just the last hour, it had oxidized enough to betray its presence. A sign, a warning, a second chance for him, and for her. But no one in that room was looking at the clause. They were looking at the spectacle of wealth about to coronate itself. The investors leaned in. The archivists held their breath. The appraiser pushed his glasses up his nose, smiling with polite triumph. And the Sheikh, he looked almost reverent. "Let us finalize," he said. Every muscle in Layla's body tightened. She felt the security officer's presence beside her, subtle, ready, unconsciously blocking her exit, even though she had no intention of leaving. Not anymore. She stepped a little closer to the partition, the edges of the spotlight brushing against her uniform. No one noticed. She was still background, still furniture, but she could see everything with terrifying clarity. The contract had 4 signatures boxes. 3 were already filled. Only the Sheikh's remained empty, and now she could see what the modification actually did. The medieval clause wasn't decorative, it wasn't symbolic, it was a legal override. An inheritance-engineered trap that allowed the seller to seize the manuscript, the institute, and all related intellectual assets in the event of provenance dispute. Which meant, the moment the forgery was exposed, and it would be, because forgers always slip eventually, the seller would legally reclaim everything, leaving the Sheikh bankrupt and publicly humiliated. It was theft disguised as scholarship, fraud disguised as prestige, and the waitress, the invisible one, was the only person in that room who understood what was about to happen. Her fingers curled around the edge of the partition. Her heartbeat synced with the slow arc of the pen descending toward the page. This was it. If she didn't intervene now, there would be no reversing the damage. By morning, the Sheikh's empire would begin to fracture, and she would be remembered only as the thief they blamed for a cufflink that was never lost. She took one quiet breath. The pen hovered. The room held still. People believe silence is neutral. But sometimes silence is the weapon that lets monsters finish their work. The pen descended. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like gravity itself had chosen the moment. The investors leaned forward in simultaneous anticipation, their eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of men who believed they were witnessing history. The archivists exchanged subtle, victorious glances. The appraiser folded his hands behind his back, as if posing for a future documentary about this historic acquisition night. And still, no one noticed the waitress. Layla felt the pressure building in her chest, expanding, crowding her lungs. This was the moment her life always bent toward, the moment where silence protected everyone except the one who kept it. Her palms were damp, her heartbeat rang in her ears, her throat tightened with a familiar ache, fear mixed with the old grief of every door that had ever closed in her face. She remembered every humiliation in compressed flashes, her scholarship committee dismissing her research as too niche, her immigration caseworker telling her she lacked compelling value, the job placement officer who suggested hospitality work because quiet people do well there, and the professor, her mentor, who once said, "You're brilliant, Layla, but brilliance means nothing if you can't make them listen." He had been right. And tonight, she was done being unheard. The Sheikh dipped the pen tip into the signature line. A single droplet of ink clung to the nib. A heartbeat suspended. Then, something unexpected happened. As the Sheikh steadied his hand, the glass door at the far end of the suite opened again. The hotel's head of security stepped in, nodding discreetly toward the guards flanking Layla. One of them murmured into his earpiece. The atmosphere shifted, quietly, subtly, but enough for her to feel the danger closing in. They were preparing to remove her the moment the signature was done, to silence the only witness who could read the shapes of the trap. The Sheikh exhaled and lowered the pen. Layla stepped forward instinctively, only half a step, barely perceptible. But the nearest guard moved immediately, planting himself in her path. "Miss," he warned quietly. She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the contract. The Sheikh's pen hovered a breath above the page. 5 millimeters. 4. 3. Then the appraiser made his second mistake of the night. He leaned in, too eagerly, causing the manuscript's gilded edge to catch the spotlight at a new angle. And in that flash, Layla saw it. A thin strip of adhesive residue running parallel to the inner margin. Impossibly modern. Undeniably artificial. Not the kind found in restoration labs. No, this was the quick-dry polymer used in printing workshops to bond synthetic vellum sheets. The kind used for high-end forgeries that needed to masquerade as ancient artifacts. Her breath caught. That was her fault line. The evidence she needed. The one thing no expert in that room could spin or excuse. And the Sheikh, unaware of the avalanche he was seconds from triggering, began to sign. Layla's voice rose inside her like a tide trying to break free of stone. Not yet. Not yet. Wait. She felt the trembling fear in her bones, but beneath it, beneath everything, a quiet courage steadied itself. For years, she had survived by staying invisible. Tonight, she would survive by stepping into the light. The pen touched paper, and she inhaled, ready. People think disasters explode. Most begin with a single, silent breath. The pen tip kissed the page. A whisper of contact, barely audible. And in that microscopic moment, time tightened around her. Layla stepped forward, not dramatically, not with a shout, simply with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the truth lived. But the guard reacted instantly, raising a hand to stop her. "Miss, do not approach." She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the manuscript, specifically the exposed inner margin now glinting with that impossible, modern adhesive. She took another step. The guard blocked her path fully. Investors looked up, annoyed at the interruption. The Sheikh paused mid-stroke, the ink forming the first curve of his signature. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his tone sharp, his clipped Gulf dialect thickening with irritation. Layla spoke without looking at him. Her voice was quiet, steady, unwavering. "Do not sign." The room froze. A waitress telling a billionaire what to do, in the most high-stakes moment of his financial year, was a violation so absurd that even the archivists forgot to breathe. "Remove her," one investor snapped. But before the guards could touch her, Layla lifted one hand and pointed, not at the Sheikh, not at the contract, but at the manuscript. "Page 12, she said, her tone almost clinical. "Inner margin. There is adhesive residue that should not exist on a document from the 14th century. The appraisers stiffened, the archivists exchanged confused glances, and the Sheikh's advisor blinked, a flicker of panic breaking through his composed facade. Layla continued, stepping sideways so the spotlight edge brushed her uniform, just enough to make them see her. "That adhesive is used for bonding synthetic vellum sheets during digital reproduction. It's not medieval, it's not archival. It's modern manufacturing residue." The Sheikh frowned. "What are you saying?" Her gaze sharpened. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "That manuscript is a forgery." The words detonated silently. The investors stiffened. The archivists paled. The appraiser's mouth parted, but no words escaped. Someone dropped a fork. Layla walked forward another step, and this time the guard didn't move. Everyone wanted to hear what she would say next. She pointed again, precise, forensic. "And the ink modification in your contract, right beneath the signature box, was done with iron gall ink, a medieval mixture, one that darkens as it oxidizes. It was added after the document was drafted." The Sheikh's advisor went rigid. Layla locked eyes with the Sheikh himself. "If you sign, that clause will override the entire contract, using an inheritance doctrine buried in medieval property law. It will grant the seller ownership of every asset linked to this acquisition the moment the manuscript's provenance is legally challenged." The Sheikh stared at her, stunned, disoriented, like someone waking up inside a nightmare he didn't know he had entered. She finished calmly. "They engineered a forgery, so the dispute would be inevitable. You were meant to sign a guarantee of your own bankruptcy." Silence. Dense. Electrified. Flawless. The appraiser finally blurted, "That's absurd." "She is a waitress." Layla cut him off with a single quiet sentence. "Check the margin under UV." The archivists froze. That was the test. The one test no forger could survive. The Sheikh exhaled slowly, something ancient and violent shifting behind his eyes. He looked at her, not with superiority, not with annoyance, but with the unsettled realization that this woman he dismissed minutes earlier had just saved him from signing away everything he owned. Fear and anger warred in the air. Power had tilted. The room had cracked. Truth, she realized, does not shout. It waits for the courage of one person willing to name it. The Sheikh pushed his chair back, hard enough that its legs screeched against the marble floor. Every person at the table flinched. "Bring the UV," he ordered. Not a request, a command sharpened by humiliation and fury. The archivists scrambled, nearly tripping over their equipment cases. The appraiser tried to protest, but the Sheikh silenced him with a single raised hand. The obsidian pen remained hovering above the paper, ink bead trembling, a frozen catastrophe. Layla stood perfectly still. She had crossed the line. There was no going back. The head of security approached cautiously, unsure whether to detain her or protect her. The maitre d' looked on the verge of collapsing. The investors exchanged anxious glances, realizing the night had slid out of their control. When the UV lamp flicked on, the room dimmed further, spotlight narrowing, shadows lengthening like something ancient had been summoned. The archivist angled the manuscript, page 12. The ultraviolet glow washed over the surface. And then, there it was. A bright, unmistakable fluorescence along the inner margin. Polymer adhesive. Modern. Synthetic. Impossible to explain away. The appraiser's face drained of color. The Sheikh stared at the glowing residue as though looking directly into betrayal itself. But Layla wasn't finished. "Now the contract," she said softly. The room turned to her. She pointed to the signature box, right beneath the Sheikh's halted pen stroke. The archivist hesitated, then passed the UV lamp over it. The moment the light hit the modified clause, the medieval ink flared, violet black. A spectral bruise beneath the surface. The Sheikh inhaled sharply. The investors whispered frantically. The advisor's face twisted in dread. The appraiser closed his eyes. Layla finally stepped into full light, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. Iron gall ink changes molecular structure as it oxidizes. It darkens. That means it was added after the contract was printed. After your advisor signed his portion. After the legal review. She paused, letting the truth settle in the center of the room like a dropped stone. It was placed there to activate only with your signature. The Sheikh turned toward his advisor, eyes blazing, not with loud anger, but with something far more dangerous, controlled, ice-cold clarity. "You knew about this." The advisor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His silence was an admission louder than any confession. The Sheikh looked back at the waitress, the invisible woman he had insulted, dismissed, accused, now standing at the center of the room, illuminated not by uniforms or status, but by irrefutable truth. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Layla lowered her gaze for a moment, not in submission, in preparation. Because to explain her knowledge, she would have to reveal the life she'd buried, the research she'd abandoned, the brilliance she'd learned to hide. And when she lifted her eyes again, something steady and resolute had settled behind them. The Sheikh waited. The room waited. Even the guard seemed suspended between duties. Layla drew a breath, and for the first time in years, she prepared to name the version of herself she had never been allowed to be. People spend fortunes searching for the truth. But sometimes, the truth arrives in the voice they never thought worth hearing. She did not answer his question. Not yet. Instead, Layla walked toward the table, slowly, deliberately, until she stood opposite the Sheikh, the manuscript between them like the exposed heart of a crime scene. No one stopped her. Not because they trusted her, but because they could no longer deny what she saw. She reached, not touching anything, just pointing, movements measured like a surgeon explaining an open wound. "Look at the ruling lines," she began softly. 14th century scribes drew guidelines by hand. Imperfect, slight wavering, natural human deviation. The investors leaned closer despite themselves. She raised her hand a little. "Now look here." The archivist angled the UV lamp. Under the violet glow, a horizontal rule shimmered with unnatural precision. "Machine straight," she said. "Printed, not drawn." The appraiser swallowed. The Sheikh's expression sharpened. She shifted to the manuscript's binding. "The stitching is wrong. This pattern didn't exist until the 1700s. A true medieval codex would show tension, inconsistencies, uneven thread bite, slight torque near the spine. But this, perfect spacing, perfect tension, modern bookbinding done to imitate antiquity. One investor whispered, "My God." But she wasn't done. Now the pigment. She motioned for the lamp to move upward. Under UV, the manuscript's marginal illuminations glowed faintly blue. Layla's voice never trembled. These pigments contain optical brighteners introduced in the 20th century. Medieval scribes did not have access to them. The glow you see is from fluorescence additives used in commercial inks. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating quiet. Then she turned, not to the manuscript, but to the contract beside it. "And this," she continued, "is the most important part." She pointed directly at the shimmering clause. Iron gall ink was used for the modification because it reacts like genuine medieval ink under UV. Whoever forged the manuscript used the same mixture in your contract to create a legal bridge between the two. The Sheikh frowned. "Explain." Her eyes met his. "If the manuscript is ever challenged, which it will be, the clause you almost signed would automatically transfer all related assets to the seller. It reverses the burden of proof." She let that sink in. "It means you would lose even if you won." The Sheikh's jaw tightened. The advisor beside him looked ready to collapse. Layla stepped back a fraction, giving them space to absorb the enormity of what had been engineered around them. Her voice softened, clinical, precise. They needed the manuscript to appear perfect, so no one would question it until the transfer was complete. And they needed someone to blame for anything that went missing during the distraction. Her eyes flicked toward the cufflink. "It was planted," she said, "to pull your attention toward a convenient suspect and away from the forged artifact you were about to secure with your signature." The Sheikh stared at her with an expression she had never seen directed at her in her entire life. Respect born of shock. "Whoever you are," he whispered, "you just saved me from ruin." Layla lowered her gaze again, feeling every heartbeat in her body. She didn't feel victorious. She felt exposed. And yet, something in the room had shifted irrevocably. The waitress was no longer invisible. People fear being wrong, but they fear even more the person who can prove it. The Sheikh motioned for his advisor to step forward. The man could barely lift his eyes. "You will explain this?" the Sheikh ordered, but the advisor's voice came out thin, strangled. "Your Highness, I only reviewed the main draft. I never saw—" "Enough," the Sheikh snapped. And then, quieter, colder. "You were meant to protect me from this." The advisor shrank back. Layla felt the weight of every gaze turned toward her, not with hostility now, but with the stunned realization that the night had rewritten itself around her. But she wasn't finished. "Your Highness," she said softly, "there is something else in the contract you need to understand." The Sheikh looked at her sharply. "More?" She nodded. "Page 5. Third paragraph." The archivist flipped to it immediately. She continued, voice precise, steady. "That paragraph appears to be a standard indemnity clause. But it isn't. The punctuation has been altered, specifically a single comma placed after initial custodial transfer." The Sheikh frowned. "A comma?" Layla nodded again, her expression tightening. One comma changes the meaning of the entire clause. It shifts liability from after the transfer to during the transfer. It means that if the manuscript is ever proven fraudulent, you, not the seller, would be legally responsible for having accepted it in that state. The investors inhaled sharply. She added with careful clarity, "In plain terms, the clause makes you the author of the fraud." A ripple of outrage swept through the room. "That is impossible," one archivist protested. "No one drafts—" Layla interrupted gently. They do if they intend to frame the buyer. Eh? The Sheikh's knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. She stepped closer, not too close, but enough to show confidence instead of fear. The modified medieval clause you saw earlier doesn't work alone, she explained. It needs this punctuation shift. Together, they transfer ownership to the seller through dispute, then place legal blame on you for having received a fraudulent manuscript. She folded her hands. They would take your institute, your assets, and your reputation, and you would be the one accused of forging the manuscript. Silence hit the room like a dropped anchor. The Sheikh stared at her, not blinking, not breathing. This was designed to destroy me, he said softly. Layla nodded. Not just destroy you, erase you. The advisor began shaking his head, tears forming. I didn't know. I didn't see. One investor hissed, You signed it. The Sheikh's voice cut through the noise, low and lethal. What would have happened if I signed? Layla answered without hesitation. Within days, the seller would challenge the manuscript's authenticity. The clause would trigger. Ownership would revert to them. You would be investigated for submitting falsified cultural material to your new institute. Your accounts would be frozen, your reputation demolished, and every asset named in the contract would be seized to offset damages. She paused, and the narrative would be that you tried to pass off a forgery as real. A bone-deep chill filled the room. The Sheikh leaned back slowly, eyes narrowed. Not at Layla, but at the orchestrators of the fraud. Someone in that room was not who they pretended to be. She saw realization dawning across his face, then fury, then something more dangerous. Resolve. Who designed this? He asked quietly. Layla lifted her chin. You already know the answer. Because traps this elegant are never external. They're built by someone standing very, very close. The Sheikh stood slowly, the leather of his chair whispering against marble. His face had transformed, no longer confused, no longer humiliated. Now it carried the stillness of a man who understood that betrayal had come from inside his circle, not outside it. He looked at his advisor, long, unblinking. You brought this deal to me, he said. It wasn't shouted. Quiet was worse. The advisor's mouth trembled. Your Highness, I only reviewed what was sent. The seller drafted nothing, Layla said softly, stepping between them without thinking. Someone in this room engineered every detail. Someone who had access to medieval ink formulations, to digital vellum sheets, to high-resolution pigment printers, and to your legal review cycle. Eyes darted nervously across the table. Investors shifted in their seats. The archivists looked insulted by the implication, but fear was already dripping through their composure. Layla walked toward the manuscript again, her voice calm, almost forensic. This forgery is not amateur work. It required a medieval ink base, synthetic vellum with collagen density adjusted to mimic age, period-authentic marginal ornamentation templates, legal expertise in inheritance doctrine, access to your internal document flow. She looked up. One person here meets all five. Silence tightened around a single figure. The investor with the restless foot, the one who arrived last, who pushed the hardest for the Sheikh to sign tonight, who kept his briefcase angled away from everyone else. He froze. His foot stopped its rhythm. The Sheikh's voice slid across the room like a blade. Open your case. The man didn't move. I said open it, the Sheikh repeated. Security stepped forward. Two guards approached. The investor's jaw clenched. It's confidential material, he protested, forcing a calm he didn't possess. Layla's eyes narrowed. Confidential, she said quietly, like the spare vellum sheet sticking out of the side pocket. He flinched. One of the archivists inhaled sharply. That is the same grain pattern as the bark manuscript. The Sheikh nodded at security. Open it. The briefcase was unlatched, the lid lifted, and the room exhaled in shock. Inside lay synthetic vellum sheets, a portable pigment printer, Yuka UV reactive calibration strips, iron gall ink vials, a draft of the contract with handwritten notes, and a vellum test page with the bark manuscript's illuminations half-printed across it. A smoking gun, neatly packed in leather. The investor's face twisted into something between rage and resignation. "You don't understand," he hissed. "This acquisition would have made all of you richer. Every one of you. The Institute would have tripled in value once the narrative took hold." "And when the fraud surfaced," Layla asked coldly. He hesitated, just long enough for the truth to bloom. "You would have been blamed," she continued. "Not him, not the board. You." The Sheikh's eyes sharpened. "You engineered this trap under the pretense of partnership." The investor spat. "You think I would let a man born into power own what I built? You think legacy is inherited? No, it is taken." Layla spoke before the Sheikh could. "You were never after the manuscript. You were after the collateral damage." The investor smirked. "History favors those who write its documents." Layla stepped closer, her voice steady and devastating. "And it protects those who can read what others overlook." The Sheikh inhaled deeply. He wasn't looking at the guilty man anymore. He was looking at her. "That is why you saw this," he murmured. "When none of us did." Layla lowered her gaze, not out of modesty, but to steady her own heartbeat. She didn't want gratitude. She wanted the truth to stand. Security seized the investor's arms. The forgery collapsed the moment it met light. Schemes always do, because deception thrives in brilliance, but dies in scrutiny. The investor didn't struggle. He wasn't the type who panicked when a plan collapsed. He was the type who recalculated. Even as the guards restrained him, his eyes stayed sharp, predatory, flicking from the Sheikh to the contract to the manuscript, as if searching for a loophole he hadn't already manipulated. "There is no proof I intended harm," he said smoothly. "Possession of restoration materials is not illegal. You can't—" Layla stepped forward, the spotlight catching the edge of her cheek. It made her look like the only steady point in the room. "You left the evidence inside the binding," she said. "Synthetic vellum adhesive. Ink that oxidized unevenly. Digital pigment layering visible under magnification. Your calibration sheet is identical to the manuscript's color spectrum." Her gaze hardened. "You engineered a forgery precise enough to fool experts. Except you made one mistake." The investor lifted his chin. "Which is?" Layla pointed to the manuscript's final page. The scribe who wrote the original bark manuscript used a proportional rubric system. Medieval scholars measured page layout using palms and fingers. But your replica follows an A-series metric ratio. A modern printer default. A flush of red mounted on his neck. "You copied perfection," she continued, "not authenticity. Forgers always do." The room let out a collective breath. Even the guards paused, as though they too were beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had unraveled. The Sheikh exhaled slowly, fury cooling into something much more controlled and much more dangerous. "Take him to the holding suite," he said to security. "No exit, no calls." The investor's smirk finally cracked. As he was escorted out, he snarled over his shoulder. "You think this ends with me? You think you're safe? She saved you tonight, yes?" His eyes slid to Layla, sharp with spite. "But she doesn't belong in your world. Tomorrow she'll be invisible again." He disappeared behind the glass door. Silence settled, thick, electric. The Sheikh turned to Layla. "Is that true?" he asked softly. "Are there others involved?" She hesitated, not because she doubted, but because she knew how deep these schemes could run. "There may be," she said. "Forgery networks never rely on a single point of failure. Someone supplied the vellum. Someone provided the contractual phrasing. Someone authenticated the manuscript before tonight." The archivists stiffened. One lifted a hand. "You're not implying—" "I'm stating," she said gently, "that provenance is only as honest as the people defending it." Her words cut deeper than accusation. They were a diagnosis. The Sheikh nodded slowly, absorbing the enormity of what she'd revealed. One of the investors whispered, "This will trigger investigations, lawsuits, scandal." "Yes," Layla replied quietly. "But if he had signed, the scandal would have belonged to you. Now it belongs to the people who built it." The Sheikh studied her. Really studied her. Not as a waitress, not as a suspect, but as the only mind in the room capable of seeing the truth before it detonated. "Tell me," he said softly, "what made you look?" Her breath caught. The question pierced deeper than she expected. "Because you all looked at the performance," she said, "not the details." She lifted her chin. "And details are where people bury their intentions." The Sheikh nodded once, slowly. It was then, in that quiet, suspended moment, that Layla understood something essential. Power doesn't shift with volume. It shifts with clarity. The manuscript lay open on the table, no longer a relic, now merely evidence. The archivists, their pride bruised and trembling, gathered around it in stunned silence. The investors hovered behind them, suddenly unsure how to stand, how to breathe, how to reconcile that they had nearly applauded their own destruction. The Sheikh sat again, but this time he did not lean back in authority. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped, eyes fixed on Layla. "Walk me through it," he said. "Every step. I want to know how close I came." Layla inhaled slowly, closer than anyone in this room realizes. She approached the contract first. "You were meant to sign tonight, because the ink implantation in the clause is unstable. Iron gall ink begins oxidizing immediately. In 72 hours, its age would have doubled. Within a week, it would appear centuries old." She paused. "By next month, it would have been indistinguishable from authentic, medieval ink." Heads turned. Breath sharpened. She continued. "The moment the forgery was exposed, the seller would activate the clause. You would be accused of knowingly submitting a fraudulent artifact. Your institute would be seized to mitigate damages. And the man you just detained would acquire everything." The Sheikh's jaw tightened. "And the cufflink?" "A distraction," she replied. "He needed your anger, needed your attention fixed on me so no one noticed the manuscript's flaws during the reveal. High tension blinds people. Fear narrows focus." The maître d' looked devastated. He'd believed the lie. Everyone had, except her. She walked toward the manuscript, tapping the air above its margins. "The forgery's good, exceptionally good, but not perfect. Synthetic vellum is too obedient under pressure. Real vellum resists. Your appraiser should have felt that." The appraiser winced. "Your archivists should have questioned the pigment glow. Medieval illuminations never fluoresce this evenly." The archivists lowered their heads. "And the investor," she gestured to the empty space where he had stood. "He knew your habits, your impatience, your pride. He tailored the trap to your psychology." The Sheikh looked up sharply. "Explain." Layla met his gaze without flinching. "You like decisive action. You prefer immediate closure. He built a deal that required urgency. He made it appear clean, flawless, irresistible, because he knew you would not delay a signature for something that already felt like triumph. The room was silent, and he planted one final layer, she added. The Sheikh frowned. Another? She nodded. Reputation leverage. If you had accused him without proof, he would have painted you as a paranoid buyer, afraid of cultural scrutiny. He had statements prepared, articles drafted, expert endorsements ready. The narrative was built. The investors exchanged horrified looks. The Sheikh's voice dropped. A trap with multiple escape-proof exits. Layla nodded. Except one. His eyes sharpened. You. She didn't deny it, but she didn't accept it either. She simply said with quiet clarity, I saw what everyone else expected not to see. The Sheikh leaned back, studying her again, this time with something softer, something dangerously close to admiration. Why didn't you speak earlier? He asked, before the presentation began. She looked down at her hands. Because people like me are only believed when the disaster is seconds away. The room absorbed her truth in painful silence. Then the Sheikh spoke again, his voice low. You saved my life's work tonight. She didn't reply. But the archivists, the investors, even the guards, they all watched her now with a reverence they had never granted her before. Because insight is a form of power. And she had wielded it flawlessly. The aftermath moved slowly, like a room waking from anesthesia. The archivists packed the forged manuscript into an evidence crate with trembling hands. The appraiser stood like a collapsed monument, staring at the floor. The investors whispered to each other, half in fear, half in awe, finally understanding that their names had come inches from being attached to the largest cultural fraud of the decade. And Layla? She stood at the very edge of the light, still in her service uniform, still the person no one had intended to hear tonight, but no one could unsee her now. The Sheikh dismissed the remaining staff with a gesture, leaving only a few guards, the investors, and Layla. When the door closed, he turned to her with the steady calm of a man who had gone through the fire and come out recognizing the one person who pulled him out. I owe you an apology, he said. The room exhaled. Even the guards shifted. But Layla didn't flinch. She didn't bow her head. She didn't say, it's nothing. She let the silence hold. Because this was the first time in her life she had the power to choose what silence meant. The Sheikh continued, voice lower. I accused you without cause. I used words that were beneath me. He didn't need to say more. They both remembered the tone he had used, the clipped dialect that reduced her to something small. Layla finally spoke, her voice even. You didn't see me. He blinked. I see you now. It wasn't a line. It wasn't flattery. It was an admission, quiet and monumental. Layla nodded once, accepting the truth but not the absolution. She stepped closer to the table. There's something you need to understand, she said. If I hadn't been serving tonight, if I hadn't glimpsed the ink when the folder opened, this would have worked. It was designed to work. The investors stiffened. They needed this spelled out. The forger exploited 3 vulnerabilities, she explained. 1. Your pride. 2. Your trust in expert consensus. 3. The assumption that someone like me could not possibly know more than the people you pay. The Sheikh absorbed this, slowly, without defensiveness. Then he asked the question the room had been waiting for. How did you know? Truly know? She took a breath, steady, anchored. Because forensic linguistics was my life, she said. Paleography, medieval ink chemistry, restoration ethics. I studied manuscript fraud for 6 years before my scholarship was revoked. The Sheikh's eyes widened with quiet devastation. He looked at her not as a waitress, But as a scholar forced off the path, she was born to walk. "What happened?" he asked. She stared at the manuscript crate, at the life she could have led. "My mother became sick. I dropped out to care for her, lost my visa sponsorship, took the jobs I could get." A painful silence settled. One investor murmured, "You should be leading an institute, not carrying plates." Layla shook her head slightly. Life doesn't rearrange itself around talent. It rearranges around survival. The Sheikh inhaled deeply, emotion tightening his posture. "You saved me from losing everything I built," he said. "But you also showed me something else." She looked up. "That your invisibility was not an accident," he said softly. "It was a failure of every room you ever walked into." Her chest tightened at that, not from hurt, but from recognition. He held her gaze. "You will never be invisible in one of my rooms again." The words struck her with quiet force. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply breathed, freely, for the first time in years. Because dignity is oxygen. And she had finally inhaled. The suite felt different now, as if the architecture itself had shifted to acknowledge her. No one spoke. The investors watched her with a kind of reverent caution, unsure whether they were witnessing the end of a scandal or the beginning of a legend. The archivist stood stiffly, humbled by the quiet force of a woman they dismissed without a glance. The Sheikh folded the contract shut and placed the obsidian pen on top of it. Not like a tool, but like a weapon he no longer trusted. Then he turned fully toward her. "What happens next?" he said. "Depends on you." Layla blinked, guarding her breath. It was the first time anyone had said those words to her without condescension. The Sheikh continued, voice low, deliberate. "My institute was built to preserve what is real. History, language, truth. Tonight showed me that the people I trusted cannot read danger, even when it glows under ultraviolet light." His gaze softened, but his tone stayed sharp. "But you can." Layla felt something tighten inside her. Not fear, not disbelief, but the slow rise of a truth she had suppressed for years. She had spent so long being unseen that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed for her mind. The Sheikh gestured toward the evidence crate. "I want you to lead a forensic division. Small, elite, independent, answering only to me." Silence rippled across the room. The investors stiffened. The archivists looked stunned. The appraiser closed his eyes, devastated by the implication of what she would replace. Layla didn't move. She knew the cost of power. She knew its shadows. She knew its price. And she knew offers like this were rarely pure. "Why me?" she asked quietly. The Sheikh didn't hesitate. "Because you saw a trap designed for kings," he said. "Because you read intentions hidden beneath ink. Because every expert in this room looked at a performance, and you looked at the truth." His voice lowered further. "And because you didn't stay silent, even when silence would have protected you." Her pulse quickened, not with ambition, with the fragile, unfamiliar sensation of being recognized without being used. But she wasn't ready to step toward that light without examining its edges. "What if I refuse?" she asked. The Sheikh's expression softened with surprising honesty. "Then I will thank you, compensate you, and let you walk away. No pressure, no expectation, no punishment." His gaze held hers. "But you will walk away from a room where you were finally seen." Those words landed somewhere deep. A place she had kept sealed for years, where her abandoned research still lived like a small, wounded animal. Layla looked at the manuscript crate, at the contract, at the UV lamp still humming softly on the table. She thought of the woman she became. Quiet, careful, bent by necessity. And the woman she had once hoped to be. She inhaled slowly. "Before I decide," she said, "I need to understand one thing." The Sheikh nodded. Layla's voice steadied. "Why did you believe me?" He hesitated, not searching for an answer, but choosing whether to speak the truth. When he finally did, it was quieter than she expected. "Because you spoke the way truth speaks," he said, with precision, with evidence, with no interest in how it would make you look. Something inside her trembled, and then he added, barely above a whisper, "And because when I tried to break you with my words, you didn't break." Layla lowered her eyes, steadying herself against the sudden weight of being fully seen. The room held its breath. Truth can expose a lie, but sometimes it exposes a person too. Layla stood in the center of the suite, the quiet hum of the UV lamp fading into the background. The manuscript crate was sealed. The contract lay untouched. The conspirator had been escorted away. But the real tension, the one that gripped the room now, came from her silence. The Sheikh waited. The investors waited. Even the guards held their breath, sensing that something more delicate than justice was unfolding. Layla's heart thudded in her chest, not from fear, but from the weight of possibility. For years, she'd defined her life by what she'd lost. Her research, her stability, her mother, her path. Now, for the first time, she was being asked to define it by what she could become. She stepped toward the Sheikh's table, stopping where the spotlight softened just before reaching her. A familiar instinct, keep to the edge of visibility, but not tonight. She took one more step, into the full light. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly. "If I take this position, I will not be ornamental. I will not stand behind people who ignore what they don't understand. I won't soften my findings or dilute a truth that's inconvenient." Her voice steadied, almost fierce. "If I lead this division, I lead it on my terms." The Sheikh absorbed this with an expression that bordered on relief. "Good," he said. "Truth does not serve anyone who fears it." Layla exhaled slowly, a breath she'd been carrying for years. "Then I accept," she said. The Sheikh nodded once, respectfully, not triumphantly, not possessively, respectfully. "You begin when you wish," he said, "not when I command." The investors exchanged glances, some stunned, some uneasy. They knew what her presence meant. No more shortcuts, no more convenient truths, no more elegant deceptions wrapped in expensive paper. Sheikh Nadim, so confident hours ago he nearly signed away his empire, looked at her with something like awe. "You changed the architecture of this room," he said quietly. Layla felt the meaning settle deep inside her, because architecture wasn't walls or light or marble. Architecture was power, dynamics, expectation, who speaks and who is heard. She had reshaped all of it, but as the suite began to empty, guards escorting archivists out, investors gathering their coats in dazed silence, something softer rose in her chest. A question she never allowed herself to consider. What does a life look like when you're no longer hiding inside it? As she collected her small notepad from the service station, the maitre d' approached her, eyes full of apology. "Layla, I didn't know. I should have—" She cut him off gently. "People don't see what they're not taught to look for." He swallowed hard, nodding. She turned back toward the Sheikh, who stood alone at the far end of the room, watching her with a calm, reflective expression. Not claiming her, not directing her, but acknowledging her. For the first time in years, she didn't lower her gaze. She walked toward the door that had humiliated her 1,000 times, and tonight opened for her like a beginning. The truth about transformation is simple. It never arrives with applause. It arrives with a decision. The new institute wing was quiet in the early mornings, glass walls catching the first light, marble floors reflecting pale gold, the hum of climate control protecting centuries of fragile history. Layla walked through the corridor with a badge clipped to her blazer, Director, Forensic Textual Analysis. She still carried her old calm, her soft footfall, her instinct to observe before speaking. But invisibility no longer wrapped around her like a second skin. Here, people sought her out, not for service, for insight. A year had reshaped her life gently, not loudly. Her debts were gone, her residency secure. Her days filled with manuscripts, inks, fibers, languages. The things she had once studied in secret. After double shifts, when exhaustion bent her spine, now she stood upright. At the far end of the corridor, the Sheikh waited beside a sealed case containing an artifact under evaluation. He nodded to her, not as a superior, but as someone who trusted the weight of her judgment more than the shine of any expert's reputation. "Your eyes," he said, "before anyone else's." She approached the case, feeling no fear, only certainty. She leaned in, examining the margins, the texture, the ink absorption, the stitching irregularities. A tiny smile touched her lips. "Authentic," she said. The Sheikh released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Layla turned toward the window, sunlight warming her face. She was no longer the woman waiting to be dismissed, no longer the voice ignored, no longer the quiet witness to other people's power. She had become the guardian of truth in rooms where truth once bowed. Invisibility fades when someone finally chooses not to disappear.